was various sources of old material. Okay? But we never got to the point where we talked about how you actually come up with what we think is a master Greek text that reflects the autograph. We never got to that. So that's what we're going to do today. And so I put this up because I want to make sure that Neil Lightfoot gets the credit for this, because he wrote the book back in the 60s. It's in its third edition now. And every time he does another edition, they add extra stuff to it based on new discoveries. So I just want to make sure, because I really love this book, and I want people to buy this book, and I'm just basically taking his structure and illuminating it. Literally, that's about all I'm doing. So I really like Neil's book. So the last thing we looked at was when there's textual variation, how do you figure out which one wins? And there are textual variations. You've got 5,000 Greek texts and another 15 to 20 of translations, and then you look at the same verse and slightly different wins. So we talked about that last time, and we saw principally that it really doesn't matter too much, because if you choose one or the other, the content, the theological content, does not shift at all. They're really pretty trivial in almost every respect. There's only about 2 or 3 differences that you would say, well, these are serious, we need to talk about these, but even still, there's no doctrinal content. So, like for instance, the women caught in adultery, that very famous passage, does not show up on the oldest doctrines. What? But we talked about that last time. But there's nothing in the actual story that's counter to our doctrine, our theology. And almost everyone agrees, based on the style of the story, it was originally part of John, but didn't get put in the oldest doctrines for reasons we don't understand. So everyone includes it today because it looks very John-like. And it has lots of doctrines that's consistent. So anyway, stuff like that. So today what we're going to do is look at how do you put together a New Testament text. So here's the goal. This is the goal of the New Testament, is because we don't have the autographs, which is the originally first written things, what we'd love to have today in our hands is a book that's the Greek version of the New Testament. And this Greek is the compilation of the best of our documents, and we think this is our best shot at what the original Greek was from the authors. Because if we have that Greek New Testament, then from that, you can make every modern language translation in the world. So for instance, if we have this book, which we agree is the Greek of the New Testament, our best shot at the autographs, then when you're going to make a French Bible, you start with the Greek New Testament, and you translate that Greek into French. If you want a German, you do the same thing. If you want English, you do the same thing. But everything starts from this Greek New Testament. So how do you come up with that? That's today. That's what we're going to look at today. So we're just going to look at that. And it turns out we have one of those. This is a picture taken off the internet. You can buy a Greek New Testament that is it's the sum total of our best understanding of all the thousands of documents. And there's actually 2, I won't say competing editions. This one's done by the United Bible Societies. And they do massive revisions as new information comes in. See, it has a big 5 on it. That's the United Bible Society's number 5 edition. The UBS 5 is what they call it. And when you open that up, it'll have not just the Greek stuff, but it'll have thousands of notations about the various manuscripts that contributed to getting that text. So if you're a translator into another language, or if you're a student and you want to find out why the Greek words that were chosen, this has it. There's another one that comes out of, it's called the Nestle Allen tradition. It's sort of the same thing. I think they're in edition 28 right now. But if you compare these 2 books, which are both, our best attempt at what the original Greek was, they are almost carbon copies of each other. But there's more information about the source documents in one over the other. So if you want to translate into Norwegian and you want to start from something, you don't start from an English Bible, you start from a Greek Bible to Norwegian. So that's what we're looking. So how do we get that today? That's the whole point today. Well, when you're gonna put together a modern best attempt at the Greek, there's actually 3 major authorities or places that you get your text from. Number 1, and we looked at a lot of these, was the actual manuscripts. And remember, when we say manuscripts, we mean very literally Greek handwritten. Greek handwritten. So that's manuscripts. And there's, we didn't talk much about it, but the Greek you find in the old manuscripts have three kind of regional distinctions based on where they came from. So there's a group of Greek manuscripts that came out of Egypt, Alexandria. So they'll call those the Alexandrian manuscripts. Ooh. And there's a bunch that come out of other regions. Western Europe, they'll call those the Western manuscripts. And there's Assyrian texts, they'll call it Assyrian. So there's really different regions they come out of. That helps us because since the Greek went to different places around the Mediterranean, and then they didn't touch each other for a while, you can actually test the original origin of the Greek based on where they went to. So Alexandrian and Western are the two major kind of contributions because it's just where they were. So we'll go to the manuscripts, that makes sense. Another place is the versions, and remember when we say versions, we mean translations. You got to get the lingo right. So there were translations done in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd and many centuries following that. What if you take those translations and you back translate them into Greek, so you can use those as a check? Those are really valuable because those do literally get translated in the center of the Mediterranean, and then they go way far away. So they're sort of like time capsules. So the translation happens, they get into another language, they stay in that culture for a while, and then we're going to turn around and bring them back and see if they agree with the other Greek ones. So those are really good, and we have a lot of those. And then the third major section that we get for finding out what the text ought to be are early Christian writers, and they're always called the patristic citations. Got to know the lingo. So you have pastors like in the 90s and 100 AD and through the 2nd century, 100 to 150 AD. These guys had the text, the original Greek text that we want to construct. They had these in their hands. And so they preached and they wrote, if you like, sermon text, notes for themselves and quoted out of the Bible. So if you can take their notes from the preaching they did and you extract out all the Bible quotations, can you actually reconstruct the Bible? Isn't that an interesting idea? And there's assertions all over the place where biblical scholars will say, actually, yeah, one guy actually tried to do this. He took all the patristic notes. I mean, they're just pulpit notes, and said, oh, that's a verse, pulled that out and started to compile them. Found out he could actually reconstruct the entire New Testament with the exception of 11 verses. So we have that much quoted in the patristic citations. So that's very valuable because these are frozen in time. These guys read it and wrote it down in their pulpit notes, say like around 100 AD. That's cool. So here's our sources. Those are our three sources for how we're going to try and put together our Greek New Testament. So let me give you the history now of the Greek New Testament in print. So this is how, you remember I showed you the UBS 5 edition you can buy today on Amazon. What's the history of all the printed Greek New Testaments in modern times? And they're going to use all those authorities. And we're not going to talk too much about how you pick from the different authorities because we did that in the last couple of weeks. But this is just the history of the Greek New Testament to today. So, and what you'll find, this is great, what you'll find is in the middle of this history of coming up with a printed Greek New Testament in modern times, you'll see the origins of the King James only debate. Yay! So we'll get to the bottom of that. So it starts with this guy, Erasmus. Erasmus in 1516, he is really the first guy to publish a Greek New Testament. Not the first one to actually print one. There's someone who was just like 2 years before, but the first one who translated it independently, and a publisher decided to publish it. But because there was a competition going on to get the first printed, now we're talking like printing press printed, there was a competition to get the first one out. He was really rushed to do it, and it had a fair amount of errors in it. So now we're talking Erasmus's 1516 first edition, if you want. It was like that. So here's actually a picture of it. Yeah, that's a picture of it. Whoa! And what you'll notice is on the left side is Greek, and on the right side is Latin. Now he had to do this because, remember, the Catholic Church at the time is the power, right? And they're a little bit protective of the text of the Bible because, after all, we're the Catholic Church. So for him to print a Greek New Testament was a little bit borderline out there. So what he had to do was actually have a two-language one. He had to have Greek on one side, and he had to have the Latin on the other side. And that way you could check between the two, but it honored the Catholic tradition of the Latin Bible, the Vulgate, which actually started in 400 AD. So it's not a bad transition. So he had both of them on there just to honor the church and make sure he didn't get put. But it was still, he's right on the edge. He's right on the edge right here doing this. This Greek New Testament will actually be the cause of heresy burnings of people who use it to translate modern texts. So, you got to understand the times. It's kind of iffy. But there it is. So he actually has printed the Greek New Testament and published in 1516. But there are many editions. 1519, he fixed some of the easy errors. 1522, 1527, 35, all different basically fixes on the translation. But it's the 1522 edition, the third edition, that was so popular that spawned a lot of stuff. Tyndale did the first English translation in 1526, and he used Erasmus's third edition in order to do his English translation. Read up on Tyndale. Because he did this, things didn't go well for him. Because he dared to take a holy text and make it into common man language of English. So what did he start from? He didn't start from the Latin. He started from the Greek, and that's the tradition. We want to come up with the Greek. So he used Erasmus's Greek and did that. Also, this guy, Robert Estienne, we'll talk about his Latinized name is Stephanus. He decides to also publish a Greek New Testament after all of Erasmus's, and his text is almost identical to Erasmus's third edition. It's just Erasmus. But he adds some stuff to it. It's actually, he does some really nice additions, but it's the third edition from Erasmus. The Geneva Bible, which was a huge Bible, it was used in so many places. It was conspicuous in the colonies in America. The Geneva Bible, that was the one. That was a big deal. Well, look when it was printed, 1557. So it actually is based upon Stephanus's late editions, which are all from the third edition of Erasmus. They added the Old Testament in 1560, but these all really have their source in the 1522 edition. It was a big edition. It was huge. It was just huge. And the King James Bible, which came out in 1611, and then subsequent editions, it's gone through a lot of editions, is based basically on these latest Greek texts from Stephanus, whose was actually from Erasmus. So really, Erasmus got the ball rolling because he actually published a Greek New Testament, and that was so valuable as a textbook for all these other guys that they said, from this we can go places. So people just started copying it and adding stuff to it and adding to it, and people started thinking about doing modern translations out of it. Really, the Greek New Testament that comes from Erasmus and these other guys added to was the start of the Reformation. Because from that, you could make modern translations reliably without having to rely on Latin. So it really, a lot of these light bulbs went off in guys' heads, and they said, we can make an English translation, Tyndale, or we can make a German translation, Luther, or we can, you can go on down the list. That really started everything. This was like a spark that started the Reformation, is this Erasmus's stuff. But here's the problem, and most people don't realize this. Erasmus started and completed his first, second, and third, all of his editions based on just these manuscripts. Now, we talked about the fact that there's aren't there 5,000 Greek manuscripts and 15 to 20,000 translations? I mean, what? Well, those were not known at the time of Erasmus. So Erasmus took his best Greek source materials, and this is it. 6 to 7, one of these is actually debatable, 6 to 7 minuscule Greek, and remember, minuscule Greek is the little lowercase Greek, and that's actually much later. It's the capital letter Greek that doesn't separate that. Those are the old ones. He didn't have any of the capital letter Greeks. In fact, if you look at the dates on the right, these were all penned in the 12th or 15th century. So he decided to come up with a Greek New Testament where the oldest documents were penned in the 1100s. Now, when we looked back and we saw the documents we have of Old Greek, we have a lot of them that go way before that. I know. But Erasmus didn't have them. So he took the best they had, and that's the best they had. In fact, he covered the entire New Testament with manuscripts. Most of the passages have at least 2 contributors in the manuscripts he's got out of the 6 or 7. But there's a section of Revelation that none of them covered. And it's not a big section. So what did he do to cover that hole? He went to the Latin, and he reverse translated the Latin back into Greek. It's okay. It's just a handful of verses. It's not a lot. So that's what he used. And this is going to be the beginning of the King James controversy, because this is the entirety. You notice a glaring thing that's not on there because of the time scale. We talked about the whole Bibles, like Sinaiticus, the Sinai Bible, that were found in the middle 19th century. Well, they haven't been found yet. And those are complete Greek New Testaments. So we're headed for a collision here. We've got these 6 or 7 documents of Greek, which are okay, but they're very late. They're penned in the 1100s or the 1400s. They're very late. And soon the collision is some of these oldest documents like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus and those, they're going to arrive a couple hundred years later, and they're going to be saying something different slightly. So who's going to win? That's what we're headed towards. So a little bit more about Stephanus. Interesting guy. He was a printer, and he added some nice things. He almost entirely used Erasmus's Greek, the 3rd edition. I mean, just entirely. But he added side notes and extra stuff. He also did a really cool edition. They call it the Royal Edition. If you own one of these at home, you're rich. It was a large format, 9 by 13. They call it the Royal Edition because it was given to kings and stuff like that. It was like the luxury edition, with rich Corinthian leather and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, but he's still leaning on Erasmus's text. And in 1551, he's the guy that put the verse numbers in the Bible. So if you don't like where the verse numbers are, you can blame him. Yeah, he's the guy. And he also did this at kind of a rush. The stories go that he was on a horse on his way, or in a carriage on his way to a printer, and decided he was going to add this at the last minute. And so while he's in there, he's doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's the legend. Then came Theodore Beza. We looked at Beza a while back because some famous documents that he had. He was a contemporary of Calvin. He was one of the Protestant reformers. So he was really big into getting this Greek New Testament put together because it was gonna make the new translations go. Remember, we talked about this book called the Codex Bezae, which he had, and he donated it basically to Cambridge. So anyway, he's the one who had that, and came up with several Greek editions in the late 1500s. But again, largely Erasmus's Greek, almost entirely, because none of these guys had any new Greek documents. It was just the same collection of Greek documents that Erasmus had. So all they can do is add commentary, which is what they did. But it's Stephanus's Greek, which is essentially Erasmus's. So, and then there's the Elsevier's. They're a Dutch publisher. And they decided to really publish it big time. Now, they didn't publish a Dutch Bible. They published a Greek Bible, like we've been talking about. Very famous. And here's in the front, I think it's in the front fly of their Greek Bible, they say, this is translated out of Dutch, now you have the text now received by all, and the text received by all. And they're talking about the Greek text. Now you have the text. It's like, it's done. It's closed. We're finished. The text that's received by all. And if you realize the date, 1633, we're over 100 years since Erasmus's Greek. So what they're saying 100 years later is the Greek is settled. And so he called it the text received by all, which in Latin, because they wrote it in Latin, is Textus Receptus. And if you have any discussions with King James only folks, they'll talk about the Textus Receptus as being singularly superior. Well, these guys named the Greek text of Erasmus and this 100 years of publications as the solved final Greek text that's received by all. Textus Receptus. But the lion's share of the oldest Greek manuscripts have still not been discovered yet. So this is the beginning of the debate that's happening with King James. They'll say the Textus Receptus is superior to all the other Greek discoveries. Textus Receptus was the Elseviers saying that this Greek text is now solid and done, okay, in 1633. So it's still the same Greek as Stephanus and Erasmus. So it's still this limited set of sources right here that's being used for these. All the ones we're familiar with that we looked in the last couple of weeks that haven't come to light yet. And then there's this guy, John Mill. Talk about hitting the hornet's nest with a bat. John Mill comes along. Now look at the date. So we're in the late 1600s. So it's quite a ways past Erasmus. He's a theologian at Oxford. And he did a whole bunch of interesting things, but he did this 30-year effort to come up with a Greek New Testament in 1707, entitled, and this is where he hit the hornet's nest, Novum Testamentum Graecum, that's the New Testament in Greek, cum lectionibus variantibus, that cum is with lections that are different, that are variants. So what he did is he took the Textus Receptus, the Greek that everyone accepted, and he started sticking in this book other Greek discoveries that were just barely coming to light. About 100 different Greek discoveries by this time, where he says, well, this is the Textus Receptus, but we're having these new discoveries. So I think I'll publish these together in one book. and then he didn't really say anything. He didn't make any judgments about which one was right or wrong, because there were variations, because people would check and they'd say, well, yeah, here's Erasmus's 15, 16, and then here's this stuff, and go, oh, wait, what are we supposed to do with this? Well, this was heresy, because what he was deliberately doing is he was showing the world that the Greek of the New Testament may not be right, because here's some variants. Whack! Whack! So he got in big trouble because of this. There's a copy of the fly page right there. All he did was take Stephanus's, which is Erasmus Greek, and add to it about 100 newly found Greek things that are slightly variant. And a lot of the emergent documents he used were like the Greek manuscripts and translations and the patristic notes. Those started to come to light. So he said, I'll just stick these in a book and walk away. Caused a huge stir, because when people went through and tallied it up, there were 30,000 variants from these 100 extra things he added. 30,000, and that started the Textus Receptus Wars. So he sticks these together in one book, the Textus Receptus, the Greek of Erasmus, and these newly emergent 100 documents, and someone goes through and goes 1, 2, 3, and adds up the difference to 30,000. And so they see him as being a heretic because he's taking down the veracity of the Bible. Oh, didn't the Elseviers say that the text was done and it's now received by all? And then Mill sticks out these things saying, well, except that doesn't agree with all this stuff we're finding. That was the beginning of the debates of the Textus Receptus Wars. He died 2 weeks after his publication, which was probably good, because the nastiness that came out after that was just horrendous. It was horrendous. And no one questioned Mill as a scholar, and he didn't really interpret what was there. He just stuck the documents in there and said, well, there you go, and let them debate it, and he died, so he wouldn't have to be in the middle of it. And then came Richard Bentley, who was kind of a contemporary of him, another scholar, really, really great guy, from Trinity College in Cambridge. He's seeing this go on the sides after Mills dies. He's seeing all this people hitting each other with sticks over, is the Textus Receptus right? Or what about the 100 documents that Mill stuck in? Which is right, which is wrong? Heresy, not heresy. He sees this going on and tries to bring calm to the whole thing. He does a really great job, in fact. He was known at the time for taking Newtonian physics, Newton's physics, and teaching it at Cambridge and proving the existence of God with Newtonian physics. Way cool. I've read some of these. The guy's brilliant. But he entered into this discussion about Mill stuff, and he wrote this pamphlet called Remarks on a Late Discourse of Free Thinking. This was his attempt to try and calm down the 30,000 difference kind of things going on. And he used a false name. This was a false name he put in there. Anyway, there's an excerpt right here. He's talking about this debate. So that if I may advise you, when you hear more of this scarecrow of 30,000, it's a scarecrow of 30,000, be neither astonished at the sum nor in any pain for the text. So he's trying to say, you need to just chill. It'll be okay. And 30,000 is not an alarming number, and I'll tell you why. So the pamphlet, he does a really good job at saying, let's just calm down. Look, there's thousands of words in the New Testament. To have 30,000 variations is not a big deal. And let me tell you why. So he tried to calm things down, but the debates raged. And then you do a time lapse forward into the 19th century, and these two guys, Westcott Hort, who are kind of framed in today's King James only debate as the evil twins of heresy. These are the bad guys. Well, by this time in the 1800s, Westcott and Hort are starting to see a landslide of old Greek documents. And in fact, if you remember Sinaiticus, when Tischendorf finds Sinaiticus in the desert at St. Catherine's, he found them, the first time he saw them was in the 1840s, and then he went back to try and to kind of buy them and copy them in the 1850s. And then you get to about the 1860s, it finally becomes public knowledge back in England. So we're talking 1860s, this hits the fan. I mean, complete New Testaments in Greek. And that's when these guys lived. So they're trying to deal with this landslide of new documents. So they decided to take the new documents and modify the Textus Receptus, the Greek of the 1516s. And he decides to take like the Sinai Bible and the Vatican Bible and many other manuscripts, and they came up with their own New Testament in original Greek. And now the wars are flaming. Because you have people who will stand on the side saying, Textus Receptus, the Greek of Erasmus, was good enough for 300 stinking years. Why are you stirring up the mess by this kind of stuff and publishing a new Greek New Testament that has differences from Erasmus's? Who do you think you are? Well, we have a lot of new manuscript evidence. So that's why they are demonized as being the bad guys in the Textus Receptus stuff. So they do that, and volume 1 comes out early in the year. Later in the year, they publish a volume called The Introduction and Appendix, and it's great. These are all their notes about why they made the changes they made, and they referenced which Bible sources they came from and why. That second volume has been just really, really valuable because it explains what they did. The first volume was just the Greek New Testament. That was different without any explanation. Got people really mad. They went to their favorite verses and they were different. Volume 2, he explained why. So that actually to this very day is a really valuable document. And then they decided, since they had what they thought was the settled Greek New Testament, they'd give a hand at doing an English version. Why not? Hey. So they did the English Revised Version in 1881. Again, from all the newer revealed Greek translations. At the time, we have 200 to almost 300 years of King James Bible dominance. And they had the nerve to print a Bible in English that was not the King James. Again, it fuels the fire. So at that point, the fire about the Textus Receptus versus the other documents, it really centers upon Westcott and Hort, because Westcott and Hort had the nerve to print a competing English Bible. Who do they think they are? If the Textus Receptus was good enough for the 1611 translators, it's good enough for us today. Why do you think all these new modern discoveries of older texts have any relevance at all? And today, that's the heart of the King James only debate. Is should we accept the 1611 King James? It's actually not the 1611. It's more the 18th century King James because it went through a lot of revisions. But should we accept that's limited to about a half a dozen Greek documents, the oldest of which was penned in the 1100s? Or should we do modern translations that reach back to much older translations like Sinaiticus, which is penned in the 300s? And it's a complete Greek New Testament. Complete. So that's the debate today. And many people who side on the King James only side because of the heavy tradition, will say that there was something, and I don't want to misrepresent, but there was something more divine about the Greek texts that Erasmus had. And so it's superior in that sense. And after all, we had a lot of scholars in 1611 who were hired by the king. These scholars aren't idiots, so they came up with an English translation based on Textus Receptus, the 11th century document. So, it should be okay. So why do we need to have a newer translation? So that's the content of the debate today, is really the source documents. That's why. And Westcott and Hort are the demons in the whole discussion. So today, you can buy this Greek New Testament. This is the UBS 5, the United Bible Society. So it's largely based on Westcott and Hort's publications in the early 19th century. And they've been modified. It's now, this is the fifth edition of the UBS version of the Westcott Hort text. So many times if you go out and buy a Greek text, And if you go to a Bible store, they'll say, well, which kind of tradition of Greek text do you want? Do you want the Westcott-Hort tradition, or which ones do you want? And so the Westcott-Hort tradition was revised and revised and revised. That became the United Bible Society's version 5. Nestle Allen. Nestle was a guy who did a lot of Bible Greek work in the early 20th century. Allen came about 50 years later, and they decided to do the same thing. They went in parallel. It's kind of a nice check, because you can take the Nestle Allen Bible, Greek Bible, and you can take the Westcott-Hort version with the UBS, compare them, I mean, like almost word for word identical, from two different sets of scholarly traditions using old documents. So it's kind of cool that it's so consistent that way. But see, here's the deal. All modern translations today, without question, come from this Greek text. Without question. So like I say, if you want to do a translation into Norwegian, you start with a Greek New Testament and you translate it. You don't start with an English one, because then you have two levels of translation. So every modern translation comes out of this or the Nestle Allen text, which is almost identical, which all stem from Westcott-Hort's edition of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus and all the old translations. None of them are made out of the Textus Receptus. So now you have this. Yeah, I had it right. Nestle Allen's at version 28 right now. In fact, this UBS 5, the United Bible Society number 5 version of the Greek, that was just published in 2014. There were some discoveries in the early 21st century, and they decided to just slightly change a few things inside. So that's pretty cool. That's one tradition. The other tradition, which stands today, starts with Erasmus's translation that he did, his third edition of 1520, which just had 6 or 7 source documents, and it had to reverse translate from Latin into Greek for some of the revelation. That is the only source of documents for the King James Bible, even to this very day. Those are the only source documents. And why? Because Textus Receptus, which is this collection of documents, is deemed to be superior to any other newer finds for no really good academic reason. That's just what's kind of in there. So you really have these two traditions in terms of the Greek New Testament. And I take it back. There is another version of the modern Bible from Textus Receptus that's been done, and that's the New King James Version. But if you look at the New King James Version, the these and thous were taken out and the ancient languages, the 17th century English was taken out to make it more understandable. But they still don't rely on any older documents than these ones that were penned in the 12th century. They're just blind. They deliberately don't look at the rest of those. So, yeah, Pam.
Just a question, where does the ESV come from then? This one over here.
All the others come from this on the left. So, all modern translations. In fact, if you're gonna do your own translation in some kind of dialect that your family uses, you'll start with UBS 5, or the NA28, which are just they're Greek New Testaments, and you just translate from the Greek into your language. So they all come from that one on the left. Okay, I think we're done, and we'll do questions. Next time we're going to talk about manuscripts from the sand, chapter 11, that Neil has in his book. And it's really interesting because it's about the fact that there were papyri, which is the most perishable media to write on, that somehow were preserved, but they had to be preserved in bone-dry environments where it's slightly warm. They were in the sand. So they've been preserved. So those have been much more recently discovered, and they are just fascinating. Just fascinating. So we'll do that next time.